But this morning we're going to do a little something different, and we're going to look at a lesson that is entitled Types and Shadows. And this is probably be a better setting to do in a Bible class really than in a sermon or in a lecture type. But it comes from our Wednesday night studies. On Wednesday night in the adult class, we're studying Joseph right now. And on the very first handout that we go through on Wednesday night that we looked at, there was a question. Well, I guess it really wasn't a question, more of an assignment. It was list the ways some ways that Joseph is a type of Christ. And so what I would like to do, I really want to go through that in Bible class and talk about it, but I just ran out of time. Imagine that. I ran out of time and we just didn't get it covered. And so I've been thinking about putting this into a type of sermon, and that's kind of what I want to do. But really, Joseph being a type of Christ is kind of be the quick ending of it. And so I encourage you to kind of stick with me. I'm getting there, but it's not really based upon that entire idea. You may not be familiar, probably all of us understand the word type, but you may not be familiar with it being used in a religious setting. And basically, when you talk about a type in a religious setting, you're talking about something that happened in the Old Testament in the past that's recorded for us in the Bible. And that can be any number of things. A type could be a person. It could be a certain event that's recorded in the Old Testament. It could even be an object or an institution that you read about in the Old Testament. But in the Old Testament, those items were used to pre-configure or to foreshadow or correspond, you might say, to a greater reality that was going to happen in the future. And so as you read about them in the Old Testament, you're reading about a type. And when you read about their fulfillment in the New Testament, it's what's called the antitype. And this may not all make sense at the beginning, but just kind of stick with me, if you will, and I hope I can draw it all together for a better picture of you, or for you. But the type is going to be found in the Old Testament. The antitype is going to be found in the New Testament. And usually those types that you find in the Bible, in the Old Testament, they're usually things that center on Jesus Christ himself, on something that he would do or some event that would occur within his life, or on the act of salvation or God's plan for it. And the purpose of them, as we read through the Old Testament, we know we don't live under the Old Testament law today. That was fulfilled by Christ. But the purpose is so as we're reading through the Old Testament, we can see God's plan in these types and shadows fulfilled for us in the New Testament. And that's really what they're about. They're about God's redemptive plan for mankind. And so let's start with the idea. I'm going to kind of give you the case for biblical types or shadows. And the first thing that I want to go to, of course, is the biblical evidence for the idea of there being types within the Bible. I don't want you to think this is something I came up with or somebody else, just came up with off the top of our heads. These are actually things that you find within the Bible itself. I'm going to take you to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, where Paul writes this. He says, "Now all these things happen unto them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the worlds are come." Now, you might read with me through that verse, and you might be saying, well, I don't find the word type there in any way, shape, or form. Well, you have to go back to the original language to pick up on this idea within the Bible. Now, what I want you to focus on is the word, if you're reading from the King James Version, the word ensample. If you have another version or translation, it's probably the word example. But when you go back to the original language and you look at that word in the Greek language, which the New Testament was written in, it's the Greek word tupos. Now, the root word of that is typos. And literally, if you were to translate or transliterate that letter for letter into our English language, you would have the word type. All these things happen unto them as a type and are written for our example. So here's what I want you to think about. Again, these are Old Testament events that happened. That's the type. The New Testament fulfillment of that is the antitype. And so here's the picture that we have without reading the first 11 verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. The picture is this: the Israelites and God's promises that he made for them to enter into the land of Canaan. All these things that happened to them for a type, and they're written for our admonition and our learning and as an example for us. Now, what Paul writes about, again, I'm not going to go back and read the previous 10 verses, but here's what Paul writes about in those verses if you were to go back and read them. All of those Israelites who came out of Egypt were guided by the cloudy pillar. You remember that? All of them. All of them walked through the Red Sea on dry land. All of them ate the manna that God gave to them from heaven. Paul says all of them drank water from the rock. Remember the rock that gave them water in the wilderness? But not all of them got to enter into the promised land. In fact, many of them, or most of them, were displeasing to God, and their bodies, their carcasses, literally, the original says, were left in the wilderness to rot. That's a type. So we look at that and we say, what exactly does that mean? Well, the spiritual reality of that is found in the New Testament today. And here's the antitype, or here's the fulfillment of that type. The church represents Israel. And the promises of the promised land represents for us today heaven. And so here's what Paul is saying as he's writing to them. Listen, it wasn't that these guys were total reprobates and heathens, right? They all partook of a lot of God's spiritual blessings and physical blessings. And what about us today as the church? I mean, think about it. We worship God, don't we? We've been baptized in water like the Bible tells us to do. We do good works for God, don't we? Why did Israel, many of the Israelites who partook of all these blessings of God, not get to enter into the promised land? Well, Paul describes it there in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And here's what he has to say about it. Because they lusted after evil things. Because they worshipped idols, because they committed fornication, because they constantly griped and complained to God about the lot that they'd been given in life. And so here's the application for us. Just because we've been baptized in water, just because we attend worship services, just because we do good works for God, doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily enter into the promised land. What can keep us from entering the promised land, heaven for us today? The same thing that kept God's people from entering in the Old Testament. Are we lusting after evil things? Do we want to do evil and wicked things? Are we guilty of committing fornication? Are we worshiping idols? Well, we may not have physical idols like they did, but are we putting people and things in our life before God? Are we guilty of griping and complaining constantly about the lot that God has given us in life? You know what happened to those people in the Old Testament? They died without entering in the promised land. They were punished. What's going to happen to us today as God's people? The very same thing. And so, here's what Paul is saying. All those things that happened to the Israelites in the Old Testament were a type, or are a type for us today. All right, the second idea, the biblical evidence for shadows. It's found in Colossians chapter 2 and verses 16 and 17. Again, we're looking at the writings of Paul, but here's what he says. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days. I want you to notice all those things are Old Testament things, right? When we're talking about the Sabbath, when we're talking about the new moon, we're talking about, those are Old Testament things. So he says, don't let anybody judge you when it comes to those things. But now notice verse 17, which are a shadow of things to come. Okay, you have these Old Testament things that shadow some greater spiritual reality in the New Testament. And here's basically what we get to understand. You don't have to say, are types and shadows different? No, not really. We're really talking about the same thing. The idea of a shadow, though, gives you kind of a different angle if we don't really fully understand the type. And so here's what we learn about this idea. Think about a shadow. What's the significance of the shadow? Well, when an object is backlit by the sun, it casts a shadow, doesn't it? And what is a shadow, or what are some of the things about a shadow that are significant to what we're talking about here in this study? Well, when you look at a shadow, if it's a good shadow, you can basically tell what kind of object is casting that shadow, can't you? For instance, you can look at that shadow and say, well, that's a tree. You know, I know there's a tree somewhere up there. Or you might be able to look at it and say, well, that's a person. And so what you have is you're looking at the shadow. You're not looking at the object itself, but the shadow is pointing to the object. And that's really the idea of this lesson. When you look at Christ in the New Testament, you could say this: Christ is standing in the New Testament. And as you look back through the Old Testament, there's this shadow of Jesus that is being cast all over throughout the Old Testament. And so he is being revealed in these different images and people and objects that you read about in the Old Testament. That's the idea of types and shadows. Okay, and if you're totally lost right now, I want you to look at some illustrations with me to maybe help better understand what I'm trying to point out here. And if you look at these types and these shadows, what you'll find is there are different kind of categories that you'll find in these Bible types and shadows. So here's some that I mentioned. For instance, sometimes you'll read about a person in the Old Testament and something that they did, or maybe their life in general, represents something that Christ would do in the New Testament. And here's a great example of that. If you turn your Bibles back to Genesis chapter 14, you read about that the main narrative is about Abraham. If you recall the story, Lot gets captured. Abraham goes to reclaim Lot. And he conquers the kings that took Lot and took all the things of Sodom. And here's what happens. In Genesis 14 and verse 18, it says, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he, that is Melchizedek, blessed Abraham and said, blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand. And Abraham gave him, that is Melchizedek, tithes of all. There are individuals whose lives or actions foreshadow something about Jesus himself. And this is one of those instances. You know, as you're reading through this story, you come across this random guy named Melchizedek. And you might stop for a moment and say, you know, why is this guy even mentioned in this story? You know, what does he have to do with anything that Abraham was doing in recapturing Lot and you know, bringing back all the possessions of those within Sodom? And what you learn about is it's not just some random name drop here in the Bible, okay? And it's not just some meaningless person to add some depth and some believability to the story of Abraham and what happened in here. God was showing us a shadow through this meeting. It was a greater reality that was going to occur within the New Testament. Melchizedek was the shadow. Jesus was the object. And here's what we learned. And if you didn't get the chance to sit through Hank's class in Hebrews, he did a masterful job explaining some of these things. Go back. You can go to YouTube. You can go to Facebook. You can see those videos if you didn't get the chance to do that. I encourage you to do that, though. But here's what the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 7, verse 1. He says, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also gave a tenth part of all, without father, notice this, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. That's the only thing we know about Melchizedek. That's the only thing the Bible tells us about him. Very brief mention of him in the Old Testament. What happened? But here's why God put that in there for us. Because it would represent the priesthood of Jesus Christ and the reality of Jesus Christ. And here's what the Hebrew writer says in verse 3. Notice this. When you look at Melchizedek, who was his father? Well, as far as the biblical record is concerned, he didn't have one, right? Well, if I were to ask you who was his mother, I don't know. It doesn't say anything about his mother. Well, when was he born? There's no record of his birth. When did he die? There's no record of his death. Think about Jesus. Who's his mother? Well, Jesus is God. He doesn't have a mother. He was just alive in the beginning, right? Who's his father? Doesn't have a father. He's existed from all eternity. When was he born? He didn't have a birthday. When's he going to die? He's eternal. He's never going to pass away. All those things were foreshadowed through this guy, this random guy that's mentioned in the Old Testament by the name of Melchizedek. So as you read through these biblical stories, and here's the emphasis that I want to put on this to you. As we go through them, they're not just random stories of random people. They're shadows of greater things that are to come. All right, let's talk. I got to get moving here. Let's talk about the Old Testament events or occurrences. Man, this one is a good one. I can spend 2 Sundays on this. But turn over to Matthew chapter 12 and verses 39 and 40. The people are demanding of Jesus for him to show them some kind of sign that he is the Son of Man or the Son of God. He'd already shown them some signs. They saw him with their own eyes. They should have recognized him as such. But here's what he says in Matthew 12 and verse 39. Jesus answers and said unto them, An evil adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given it, but the sign of the prophet Jonas. Notice verse 40. For as Jonas, we better know him as Jonah, right? Was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. A historical Old Testament event, moment in time. And here's what we learn about this. This historic Old Testament moment in time was a shadow of a greater reality that was to come. The fulfillment, the reality of it was to come in Jesus Christ. You ever wonder why God chose 3 days and 3 nights for Jonah in the whale's belly? It wasn't just some random number that God pulled out of his mind, but it was something that was very carefully calculated and planned before the event itself ever even happened. He was showing us a shadow of the work of Jesus. Jesus would spend 3 days and 3 nights in darkness, just like Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in darkness before they both came back. And so it's a shadow of an Old Testament, and you're reading about it, you're saying, what's the significance of 3 days and 3 nights? Because that's what would happen with Christ. It's not an accident. It's not some random period of time chosen by God. It's something that God carefully planned and calculated and foreshadowed before it ever happened to Jesus himself. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 3. This is a really, really good one here too. Verses 20 and 21. Here's what Peter says in that verse. Reading from the King James Version here. Once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls were saved by water. Notice verse 21. The like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us. Now I want you to focus on verse 21 there. The like figure whereunto. The interesting thing about this phrase is if you go back to the Greek language, again, that's what the New Testament was written in. It's only one word in the Greek language. Do you know what that word is? Anti-typos. Anti-typos. You recognize it? The type in 1 Corinthians 10, 11. I told you the type is the Old Testament. The anti-type is in the New Testament. And here's, interestingly enough, if you read it from the New King James Version, here's what it says. Verse 21, there is also an antitype. Where do you get that? That's the literal language. there is also an antitype that now saves us. Here's the question. How were Noah and his family saved during the flood? Go back to verse 20. They were saved by water. The same water that destroyed everyone else saved Noah and his family. That water lifted the ark up. It lifted them up above all the destruction and all the misery and all the death that was below and underneath it. Do you ever wonder why God chose water? Because he knew the significance of it in the New Testament. And that's what it's saying. It was a foreshadow of our salvation. Just like Noah and his family were saved by water, so we today, verse 21, the like figure whereunto the antitype is, which also now saves us, is baptism. Water baptism. Just like Noah and his family were saved by water in the Old Testament, God saw that in the future. He knew what his plan was, and he foreshadowed it because he knew water salvation, or water baptism was going to be a means of our salvation. Listen, you read these Old Testament stories, it wasn't an accident that God chose water as the dividing line between the saved and the lost. And that's what you see in the great story of Noah and the flood, the shadow of what was to come. Hank did we'll keep going on Hank here. He did a lesson one Sunday evening. I don't even remember how long ago it was, but on Abraham and the offering of Isaac. And if you didn't get a chance to do that, again, go to Facebook or YouTube or to hear it and look at it. But he talked about this idea. I'm not going to re-preach what he says, but this was a shadow. Why did God ask Abraham to offer his only son, the son who he loved so much? Because that's what God was going to do for us. It was a picture of our salvation. It was never about human sacrifice. It was about a picture of our salvation. God would take his one and only son and offer him as an offering for us so that we didn't have to die on that altar. But the Old Testament, listen guys, it's full of these examples. I don't even have time to talk about this one, the objects. But it's a good one, I'll tell you that much. It's a good one. It's about the tabernacle in the Old Testament. I'm not going to read the verses, but I'm going to tell you what it's about. It's about the tabernacle in the Old Testament. You had, if you remember the setup of the tabernacle, you had two holy places within that tabernacle. You walked through one veil or curtain or door, whatever you want to call it, and you entered the holy place. And then there was a second veil through which only the high priest could enter. That was called the most holy place. Now, I want you to stop for a moment. Ask yourself this question. What's the most holy place you can think about? It's heaven, isn't it? It's where God lives. Why was the Old Testament tabernacle set up like that? To foreshadow a great thing that would happen. How are we going to get into heaven? Nobody could get in there, only the high priest, right? You had to go through the veil before you could get into heaven. You know what happens when Jesus dies on the cross? The Bible says in Mark chapter 15 and verse 38, the veil that stood between the holy place and the most holy place was ripped in half. Now, if you go back and you study Herod's temple, you're talking about a curtain that was 60 feet tall. We think of a curtain, it's this little old flimsy object hanging on a window. No, it was an object that was 60 feet tall. It was 30 feet wide. According to Josephus, it was as thick as the palm of a man's hand, about 4 inches thick. And Josephus says it took 300 priests to hang it, to take it down. That was ripped in half. And here's what the Hebrew writer says about it. That veil, as it was standing there, it was sitting there because the way into heaven had not yet been made known. How are we going to get into heaven? How are we going to get into the most holy place? The Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews 10 and verse 20, the veil was the flesh of Jesus' body. The moment that Jesus died on that cross, that veil split in two. How are we going to get into heaven? Through the body of Jesus Christ. Through the blood that he shed upon that cross. We've got to walk through the veil. We've got to walk through the blood and the body of Jesus Christ before we can enter into heaven. The way into heaven had not yet been made known. But it was a shadow. And the Bible, man, is just full of these things. They're awesome. They're awesome to me. So here's the bottom line. I told you I'm not going to spend any time on this. Well, I'm going to spend just a little bit of time. Joseph as a type of Christ. You ever thought about Joseph and the things that happened to him as being a shadow of Jesus and things that would happen to him? I'm only going to list 4 things. I'm not going to read any of the verses that I have up here, but you can write them down and look at them a little bit later. But there's one man who claimed to have found over 70 things in the life of Joseph that represented Jesus and something he would do. Over 70. Here's what I want to offer you in these 4. Maybe some more obscure ideas than what you would think of. One of the things that happened to Joseph is he was stripped of a special robe that was given to him. You know what happened to Jesus when he was died upon the cross, when they were crucifying him? He had a special robe. It was without seam, but it was stripped away from him. It was taken away. Another event that parallels Jesus is, you remember what Joseph was sold for? He was sold for silver at the price of a slave. You know what Judas betrayed Jesus for? 30 pieces of silver, the Bible says, the price of a slave. That's how much it took to buy a slave in that day and age. If you think about Joseph, there was a false story that was told about his death. Well, think about Jesus. You remember the people who came up with the story that his disciples came and stole away his body by night? And it wasn't until Joseph turned up that that story was proved to be false. Guess what happened when people saw Jesus resurrected from the dead? They learned the truth of the matter, didn't they? This is one of those amazing things to me. When you read about Joseph in prison, he's imprisoned with 2 people. Remember? The chief cupbearer, the chief baker. Remember what happens to them? One of them is killed, and one of them is restored to his place. Remember Jesus with the 2 thieves on the cross? The 2 criminals he was put with side by side? One of them was saved. One of them was lost. Listen, when you go through the Old Testament isn't just a bunch of random stories for our entertainment. They're our story. They're our story in shadows and types. And they're a glimpse into our salvation and our Savior. What would it cost? How would it be accomplished? Who would it be accomplished by? And when I read those things, to me, this gives new meaning to Romans 15:4. Those things that were written aforetime. For us, that's the Old Testament. Were written for our learning. I can go back through the Old Testament and I can see a shadow of Jesus all through it. And that's the way God intended it for it to be. It's full of types and shadows of the great plan that God would enact to save us. My hope is through this study, it encourages you to study the Old Testament more. Sometimes people say, why do we study the Old Testament? We don't live under that law. It's the story of our salvation. It's in shadows and types. You can see the fulfillment of it in the New Testament, but it's a picture of our salvation. And there's so much to learn from it. Maybe you're here this morning